Let us begin with a fact that breaks the familiar picture of the world. Africa is not poor. Africa is one of the most resource-rich continents on the planet. 60% of the world's symbiosis cobalt, the very one without which not a single Tesla battery works. 30% of all the Earth's mineral resources. Oil of Nigeria and Angola, gold of Ghana and South Africa, diamonds of Botswana, uranium of Niger, lithium of Zimbabwe, copper of Zambia. Without Africa, there would be neither smartphones, nor electric vehicles, nor nuclear energy. But at the same time, Africans are poor. The average income on the continent is one of the lowest in the world. How did the richest continent become a synonym for poverty? The answer takes 500 years. Act 1, colonial plunder. Let us start with the 15th century. European powers looked at Africa as a resource. At first, the main resource was people. The Atlantic slave trade over 300 years pumped 12 to 15 million people out of the continent. The youngest, the healthiest, the most able-bodied. A demographic catastrophe from which the continent has not recovered to this day. Then, territories. 1884. The Berlin Conference. Imagine a room where diplomats from Germany, France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal are sitting. On the table, a map of Africa. In their hands, rulers and pencils. They literally draw borders. Straight lines through deserts, rivers, mountains. Through tribes and peoples, through families. Not a single African in the room. Not one. The colonial economy worked according to a simple scheme. Everything valuable, onto a ship and to the metropole. All infrastructure was built for one purpose. A road from the mine to the port. No connections between cities, no internal economy. Education, the minimum so that locals could service the colonizers. Industry, why build factories in Congo if you can ship raw materials to Belgium? When the wave of independence came in the 1960s, African countries inherited crippled economies. Borders that had nothing to do with ethnic reality, roads leading to ports but not connecting capitals, and, the cherry on top, the debts of the colonizers. Belgium literally hung its own loans on Congo during the transfer of power. Act 2. Neocolonialism in a suit. The flags changed. The governors left. But control remained. Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, came up with a term for this. Neocolonialism. Governance without a flag. Exploitation without soldiers. The main instruments, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These institutions were created in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. At that time, most of Africa was still colonies. Out of 44 founding countries, only 4 were African. And only 2 of them, Ethiopia and Liberia, were truly independent. How does voting in the IMF work? By the size of the economy. The richer the country, the more votes. The United States have veto power. Former colonial powers control the rules, and former colonies obey. In the 1980s, the IMF launched structural adjustment programs. It sounds like bureaucracy. In practice, a noose. You want a loan? Get a list of conditions. Cut government spending. Fewer schools, fewer hospitals, fewer food subsidies. Privatize state companies. Western corporations will buy them for pennies. Remove import tariffs. Local industry will die under the flood of cheap imports. Devalue the currency. Everything will become more expensive. The result? Africa of the 1980s and 1990s rolled backward. GDP per capita was falling. Child mortality was rising. Universities were closing. Debts were only growing. Thomas Sankara, president of Burkina Faso, spoke at the summit of the Organization of African Unity in July 1987. He said, "The roots of debt go back to the roots of colonialism. Those who give us loans are the same ones who colonized us. If we do not pay, the creditors will not die. If we pay, we will die." 3 months later, Sankara was killed. His friend and associate Blaise Compaoré organized a coup. Compaoré ruled for the next 27 years and diligently paid the debts. A coincidence? In Africa, there are dozens of such coincidences. And now, let us move into the 21st century. 2024. Trade between China and Africa, $296 billion. 22% of all the continent's foreign trade. For scale, in 2000, it was $14 billion. Growth by 21 times over 24 years. China is Africa's largest trading partner for 16 years in a row. 52 out of 54 African countries trade more with China than with America. Only 2 remain, Djibouti and tiny Lesotho. But trade figures are only the tip of the iceberg. The main thing is how exactly China works with Africa. Since 2013, when Xi Jinping launched the Belt and Road Initiative, China has invested more than $170 billion in African infrastructure. Railways from Mombasa to Nairobi, ports in Tanzania and Djibouti, power plants in Ethiopia and Nigeria, airports, bridges, highways. In the first half of 2025, Africa received $39 billion of Chinese investment, growth of 283% over the year. Nigeria alone, $24.6 billion. Congo, $23.1 billion. Compare this with Western institutions. Kenya spent years, literally years, negotiating with the World Bank for a loan of $390 million for internet infrastructure. Endless studies, reports, conditions, and $3.2 billion for a railway from the Chinese Exim Bank were received in months. Chinese projects are implemented quickly. Turnkey. With a minimum of conditions. Yes, Chinese contractors build them. Yes, they bring Chinese workers. But roads appear, electricity is switched on, ports operate. After decades of talk about development, real results. And this is a real revolution. China has signed currency swap agreements with more than 30 central banks around the world. The essence is simple. We trade directly in yuan and local currencies, without conversion into dollars, without commissions to American banks, without the risk of sanctions. Nigeria is reviving a yuan-naira swap agreement. Standard Bank, the largest bank in South Africa, is promoting the yuan in 15 African countries, together with China's ICBC. Egypt, for the first time in history, issued bonds in yuan. Algeria pays China for gas in yuan. The Chinese payment system CIPS, an alternative to the American SWIFT, already has almost 1,500 participants in 119 countries. It connects 4,800 banks in 185 countries around the world. Why does Africa choose China? The answer is painfully simple. China offers what the West did not give. First, respect. China does not lecture about democracy, does not demand structural reforms, does not interfere in internal politics. It comes, builds, leaves. Second, results. Infrastructure you can touch, roads that people actually drive on, bridges that stand, power plants that give light. Third, choice. For the first time in centuries, Africa can bargain. Do not like IMF conditions? Call Beijing. Not satisfied with World Bank timelines? There is the Chinese Exim Bank. Ethiopia revised the terms of a $4 billion loan. Extended payments without losing control over the railway? Try pulling that off with the IMF. Now let us step back and look at the global picture. Africa is 1.5 billion people today. By 2050, 2.5 billion. Every fourth person on the planet will be African. Africa holds 60% of the world's cobalt. Without this metal, not a single electric vehicle battery works, not a single smartphone. Lithium, copper, uranium, rare earth elements, the very ones without which chips, wind turbines, and solar panels are impossible. And these 1.5 billion people with these resources are turning away from the dollar toward the yuan. To understand the scale of what is happening, one thing must be understood. The dollar is not just money. The dollar is an instrument of global power, the most powerful instrument that has ever existed. Here's how it works. Almost 90% of all foreign exchange operations in the world pass through the dollar. You want to buy oil in Saudi Arabia? You pay in dollars. You want to sell coffee from Brazil? You receive dollars. You want to transfer money from Tokyo to Berlin? You convert into dollars and back, and all dollar transactions pass through American banks, which are under United States jurisdiction, which are obliged to comply with American laws. This means that America can track, block, or freeze almost any transaction on the planet, and it does so. 2014, the United States disconnects Russian banks from SWIFT after Crimea. 2017, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin threatens to disconnect China from the dollar system if it does not join sanctions against North Korea. 2018, the United States withdraws from the Iran nuclear deal and imposes sanctions. Any company in the world trading with Iran loses access to the American financial system. 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, the United States freezes $300 billion of Russian reserves and disconnects the largest banks from SWIFT. This is called the weaponization of the dollar, turning a currency into a weapon. And here is what happened. The world shuddered. Not out of fear for Russia, out of the realization, if this can be done to Russia, a nuclear power, a member of the United Nations Security Council, it can be done to anyone. Today, Russia, tomorrow, it could be you. India looks at this and thinks, we buy Russian oil. What if we are next? Saudi Arabia thinks, we sold oil for dollars for 50 years. But what if one day our reserves are frozen? Brazil thinks, we trade with everyone. But what if we end up on the wrong side? As Larry Summers, former United States Treasury Secretary, said, there's a growing sense that our fragment may not be the best fragment to join. Washington sees all of this and responds. In December 2024, Trump wrote on social media, I demand that BRICS countries commit not to create a new currency and not to support alternatives to the mighty United States dollar. Otherwise, 100% tariffs. The reaction was telling. Lula, the president of Brazil, who most loudly promoted the idea of a common BRICS currency, quietly removed this issue from the agenda. Putin, who at the Kazan summit showed a prototype of a BRICS banknote, 2 days after Trump's election said, "We did not seek to move away from the dollar, and we do not seek to." At the BRICS summit in Rio in July 2025, not a word about a common currency, not a word about coordinated dedollarization. Threats work, for now. But here's the paradox. Every threat, every tariff, every sanction is another argument in favor of moving away from the dollar. As Kremlin spokesperson Peskov said, if the United States uses force to make countries use the dollar, this will only strengthen the trend toward a transition to national currencies. The dollar is trust when trust becomes conditional. We will freeze your assets if we do not like you. The countries begin to look for emergency exits. Now let us look at the other side. China gains 3 strategic assets, resources: cobalt, lithium, copper, rare earth elements, everything for batteries, chips, green energy. China does not just buy raw materials. It buys deposits, builds processing plants, embeds itself into supply chains. When the world switches to electric vehicles and solar energy, and it will, control over these resources will be worth more than oil. Markets. Chinese exports to Africa. $179 billion a year and growing by 25% annually. When America and Europe raise tariffs, China redirects goods south. Solar panels that were blocked from entering the United States go to Nigeria. Electric vehicles hit with tariffs in the European Union are sold in Egypt. Influence. 54 votes at the United Nations. Diplomatic support on Taiwan, Xinjiang, any issue. A network of allies and partners around the world. Soft power that cannot be bought with money, but can be earned through infrastructure and investment. And what does Africa get? Here, honesty requires acknowledgement. The picture is ambiguous. Africa's trade deficit with China is $62 billion in 2024. In the first 8 months of 2025, already $60 billion, almost as much as for the entire previous year. The continent exports raw materials, oil, copper, cobalt. It imports finished goods, electronics, cars, machinery. Sounds familiar? The same scheme as under colonialism. Resources flow out, added value is created abroad. Critics say this is neocolonialism with Chinese hieroglyphs, a debt trap, a new dependency instead of the old one. But there are 3 important differences. First, conditions. China does not demand privatization, cuts to government spending, or currency devaluation. It does not lecture about democracy and human rights. It builds and leaves. Second, results. Roads that are actually built, ports that work, power plants that provide electricity. After decades of promises from the IMF and the World Bank, tangible infrastructure. Third, and most important, choice. For the first time in 500 years, Africa has an alternative. You can go to the IMF or to the Chinese Exim Bank. You can trade in dollars or in yuan. You can accept the conditions or negotiate. Ethiopia revised the terms of a railway loan, extended the repayment period without losing control. China wrote off interest-free loans to 17 African countries in 2022. Try pulling that off with the IMF. Choice is power. Even if both options are imperfect, what happens next? There are 3 possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the dollar holds its ground. Trump applies pressure, BRICS retreats, a common currency remains a fantasy. The dollar keeps 60% of global reserves. The yuan gets stuck at 5%. De-dollarization remains talk. This is possible. The dollar is still the most liquid, the most reliable, the most convenient currency. There is no alternative with such market depth, such convertibility, such history. Scenario 2, slow erosion. There will be no overnight collapse. There will be a gradual shift. The dollar AS share in reserves will continue to fall from 85% in the 1970s to 60% now, to 50% by the 2030s, to 40% by the 2040s. The yuan, the euro, gold, cryptocurrencies, all slowly take bites out of the share. Trade between developing countries increasingly takes place in local currencies. SWIFT remains, but alongside it operate CIPs, BRICS Pay, regional systems. Not a revolution, an evolution. This is the most likely scenario, and it is already happening. Scenario 3, a crisis accelerates everything. Something goes wrong. A debt crisis in the United States, a loss of trust in treasury bonds, an escalation of trade wars, new sanctions that hit allies, and then a collapse. Countries massively dump dollar assets. China and Saudi Arabia switch to the yuan in oil trade. BRICS launches an alternative reserve currency not because life is good, but because there is no other choice. This is unlikely, but not impossible. Let us sum it up. For 500 years, Africa was plundered. Colonialism drained people and resources. Neocolonialism piled on debt and conditions. The IMF and the World Bank controlled the rules of the game. And then China appeared, with a different approach, with different money, with a different currency. In 2003, 18 African countries preferred China. In 2023, 52 out of 54, trade grew from $14 billion to $296 billion. At the same time, BRICS expands. Dedollarization advances. Sanctions turn the dollar from a neutral currency into a weapon, and the world notices. Is this ideal for Africa? No. The trade deficit is growing. Resource dependence remains. A new patron is still a patron. But for the first time in centuries, there is a choice. You can tell the IMF, "Thank you, we will think about it." You can trade in Yuan. You can build without lectures. This is not the end of neocolonialism, but it is the beginning of its end. 1.5 billion people are looking east. The dollar is losing a continent, and the world will never be the same again.